today's version of the Hannah Arendt virtual reading group. We're starting today the chapter 6, which is the final chapter of the human condition. I will say that in my reading of the human condition and in my approach to this book, it is my favorite chapter. Let me just ask anyone who has their microphone on, please could you mute your microphones so we don't get that feedback that I'm going to hear if your microphones are on, because then I hear my voice coming back. Thank you. So let's just remind ourselves that the book is about the human condition, not human nature. We are asking after a real question. A question is there a danger to the human condition as it's existed for the last 2,000 years, as both something humanity, as something that is both capable of advancing and progressing and changing the conditions of the world in which he lives, and as something that is given and therefore fated in a certain way and unable to change the conditions in which he lives. And Arendt is, in a very real sense, convinced that we are living through a potential transformation in the human condition. And this book, she says, is written not as an attempt to change that or alter the course of this transformation, but to think through what that transformation is and might be. How do we understand that transformation? Well, the vita activa. So this last chapter, where we're going to learn this, has two parts to it: the vita activa and the modern age. What is the vita activa? Well, we have to remember that the vita activa is opposed to the vita contemplativa, the idea that contemplation is higher than action. That was the view of the early Greeks. And Arendt is talking about how the active life is a core of what it means to be human, and has to a large degree inverted and supplanted contemplation. This chapter is going to look at another inversion, not the inversion of contemplation to action, but the inversion within the vita activa from action as the highest idea of the activity of man, the life of man, the vita activa, to first work or homo faber, and later anima laborans. So if we turn, we're not going to do it right now, but when we read the last four chapters of this last four sections of this chapter, we're going to, section by section, go through these inversions from action to homo faber to anima laborans. And the argument is going to be that in the modern age and the modern world, the vita activa itself is transformed so that our highest idea is no longer action, but is labor and thus life. To go back to the chapters on labor, work, and action that we read over the last couple of months. The second part of the title of chapter 6 refers to the modern age. And it's important to understand that for Arendt, we no longer live in the modern age. We live in what she calls the modern world. The modern world, the world we live in now, is the world of what she calls world and earth alienation. And so if you just turn back just for a second to page 6 of the book, the end of the prologue, she says on page 6, however, the modern age is not the same as the modern world. Scientifically, the modern age, which began in the 17th century, came to an end at the beginning of the 20th century. Politically, the modern world in which we live today was born with the first atomic explosions. I do not discuss this modern world, against whose background this book was written. I confine myself, on the one hand, to an analysis of those general human capacities which grow out of the human condition. These are labor, work, and action, and are permanent, that is, which cannot be irretrievably lost so long as the human condition itself is not changed. And that's the question she's asking. The purpose of the historical analysis, on the other hand, is to trace back modern world alienation in its twofold flight from the earth into the universe and from the world into the self. Okay. So this chapter on the vita activa and the modern age is to trace back modern world alienation into a twofold flight from earth into the universe and from world into the self. It's an attempt, therefore, to understand the modern age as it leads into the modern world, and in doing so, to understand the world and earth alienation, which is going to lead to the inversion in the vita activa. That's an attempt to give you an overview of the entirety of chapter 6. It's a little vague, and so I want to jump right in. Chapter 35 is called World Alienation. One thing that we will see is that chapter 36 through chapter 40, while they're not given a title, would be called Earth Alienation. And so part of what we need to start to understand is the connection and the differences between world alienation and earth alienation, which she says are the twofold flights that make up the overarching concept of world alienation. To understand world alienation, then, she says at the beginning of section 35, there are three great events that stand at the threshold of the modern age. And once again, it's not ideas in her mind that change the world, but events. Ideas can change small segments of the world, but events have wider significance. What are the three events? One is the mapping and the exploration of the globe. Why is that? Why does that contribute to world alienation? Because as we map the globe, we make distance meaningless. We can travel great distances. We make speed, we can move so fast that space is conquered. If you grew up in a small village in Poland, that was your world. That was where you lived. But now you can be a migrant, go anywhere. Of course, there's geopolitical attempts to stop that at times. But what she's saying is increasingly there's a loss of a sense that the world is close at hand. The world is big. But as we make the world smaller by traveling, she says we lose this sense of living close at hand, and the world becomes measurable. And the most important lines here are on page 251. In the paragraph beginning, there is another aspect of this matter. And she says, it is the nature of the human surveying capacity that it can function only if man disentangles himself from all involvement in and concern with the close at hand and withdraws himself to a distance from everything near him. And this is the paradox of exploration and mapping. Exploration and mapping are supposed to bring us closer to the world, are supposed to show us that the world is small and that we can know it. And yet what it does is it distances us from everything near us, so that, as she says in the next sentence, the greater the distance between himself and his surroundings, world or earth, the more he will be able to survey and to measure, and the less will worldly, earthbound space be left to him. And this is what she calls alienation. So we now, because we can follow the news in Syria or Russia or Australia, all of us are on this call from all over the world. There's people from all corners of the world, to a certain important extent, our world is less worldly, less earthbound. And we live, she says, in sort of an abstract, alienated place, alienated at least from our immediate earthly surroundings. So that's the first event that she says contributes to world alienation. The second is the Reformation, which she ties together with the expropriation of land, first from the church by the kings and the governments, and second from the peasants. So there's two parts to this. One, the Reformation, and here she's talking about Max Weber's thesis on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, and the argument is very simple. For those of you who have read the book, at least, capitalism is rooted in the Protestant ascetic ideal. Please turn your microphones off. Mute your microphones. Protestantism is rooted in the ascetic ideal, because if we're going to make money in capitalism, we want to still be one of the elect, show signs of being one of the elect, and so we don't live garishly, we live ascetically. And so our inner life is where we live, not in our exterior life. So that the Reformation brings the inner life to the fore as the most important marker of our chance for Christian elect status. The second part of this is the expropriation of the land from the peasants. And I'd ask you to turn to page 256 to understand this. But the basic, for those of you who've been reading throughout with us, the basic idea here goes back to the discussion of the difference between property and wealth. As long as the peasants had property, even if they were poor, they had a worldly space. They had something that was their own that connected them to the world. But when the peasants have their land taken away in the feudal order and they become laborers who can have nothing that they own except themselves, which they can sell, and their labor, they alienate their labor. But they alienate their labor in such a way that they lose, she says, and this is on 256 in the first full paragraph, she says, the first stage of this alienation was marked by its cruelty, the misery and material wretchedness it meant for a steadily increasing number of laboring poor, whom expropriation deprived of the twofold protection of family and property. So as long as you were a poor peasant, you still had your property and your family, which gave your life order and meaning. But when you're simply an individual laborer, you're left on your own, and you have neither property nor family to rely on. And that is an alienation from the world into yourself. One which, she says, then goes through a series of stages, first to society, where you become part of a general society. And then on page 257, as the state system declines, we become alienated. So now we're simply individuals who are part of mankind. And for those of you who know her writings on human rights and totalitarianism, the naked man who simply has nothing but human rights, she says, is the most vulnerable of all men, because they have no institutions to protect them, no property to protect them, no family to protect them, no state to protect them. And so it's this idea of expropriation and thus alienation from property and what's most your own and a worldly place, and mapping and exploration, which ties us to a world, a grand globe, but alienates us from what's local and close to us, which for Arendt form the two parts of what she calls the flight from world into the self. And that's one part of the general idea of world alienation. Okay, I'm going to stop here. This is chapter 35. and ask if there are any questions about chapter 35. Please do ask. And when you're going to ask a question, please remember to turn on your microphone so we can hear you, and then turn it off to hear the answer.
Hi, Roger.
Hi.
I have a little bit of question which is related to the way Arendt interprets history.
Yeah.
Because the way I read this section reminds me of something a bit Hegelian, I would say. Although she is not working in that framework, we know that she has been inspired by the work of Marx quite a lot. I find it significant that she says that modern age ends up with the beginning of the 20th century or the end of the 19th century. We know elsewhere she says that modern age ends up with Marx. It started with what we are just talking now, and then it stops at a certain moment. And then she says we are now in a different stage of history that she calls the modern age, open to, as you explained, being removed from Earth and the rise of automation and those things. So my question is, can we interpret this way of Arendt as a kind of philosophy of history, without eventually that she acknowledges that herself as being, in an Hegelian way, a philosophy of history, because she's criticizing that also.
Okay. Thank you, Christo. If you could turn your mic off just so we don't get feedback. Yes, I mean, Hannah Arendt is a historical thinker, insofar as she's someone for whom she's trying to understand our age as it has emerged through breaks in history. And that's something she does in many of her works. She's certainly influenced in this by Hegel in many ways, including Hegel's philosophy of reconciliation. For Hegel, in a sense, philosophy and history is an attempt to reconcile ourselves with the world as it is, and to come to terms with it. And part of that is based in Hegel's idea of the danger of philosophy becoming political, right? Which is expressed in his idea of the owl of Minerva only spreads its wings at the dawning of the dusk. Philosophy can't and shouldn't try and predict the future or direct the future. It's to try and understand the present as the culmination of a history. Arendt takes that very seriously, which is why her point is we need to understand our past up to where we are now so that we can free ourselves for a new future that we can't determine. And that's very Heideggerian in its approach. It's her idea of natality comes out of Heidegger's idea of deconstruction or destruction in Sein und Zeit. It's an attempt to destroy the sort of crustiness of tradition that has sort of solidified the past so that we don't think about it and we just keep living in a traditional way. By going back and opening it up and showing what's really happening and bringing it into a new light, we destroy the hold of tradition upon us and open the chance for a new beginning, a new jump. And this idea of freedom and natality and the newness and the freedom of how we can remake the world is very core to Arendt. And thus, this is a difference between her and Hegel. Hegel's philosophy is a reconciliation with what is, whereas Arendt insists that the proper term is comprehension, which she defines in her work as the attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. And it's that and resisting which I think is un-Hegelian. Hegel is an attempt to understand and reconcile with history. And he warns against philosophers being political. Arendt agrees with that, but she says we can, in a sense, understand and resist, and in a sense say we need to think about how to start something new. Philosophy should never tell us what that new is. Is that is that okay?
Thank you.
Yep. Is there another question on chapter 35?
I have one.
Yep.
Well, just in the sense of there is a passage on 245 talking about, well, here's the quote. I have the quote: "World alienation and not self-alienation, as Marx thought, has been the hallmark of the modern age. Expropriation, the deprivation for certain groups of their place in the world and their naked exposure to the exigencies of life." And that passage seems to condense a lot of what you were talking about. But I think there's something very interesting here, because it seems to me that she really is talking about the refugee. That the hallmark of modern life is this vast expropriation of populations all at once. I mean, especially the Second World War, and that this is a key feature, and this is, I think, very important for political theory, because it takes out the economy, right, which was so important to Marxism, and seems to suggest that states as political entities have this autonomy, and that this is the modern age, is how these states and populations are suddenly experience these failures, they're dispossessed, and so on, this massive movement of naked life.
That's great, Maurizio. Thank you. And it's another very good question. And so let me say that the quote Maurizio was reading was on page 254, not 245, and it's at the bottom of the page. World alienation and not self-alienation has been the hallmark of the modern age. And I think Maurizio makes an excellent connection to the figure of the refugee. So those of you who know Arendt's work from the 1940s know that she sees the refugee as sort of the sort of symbolic and prototypical modern subject, and the subject of totalitarianism as well. And that's for exactly the reasons that I think Maurizio was just pointing out. The refugee is like the expropriated peasant, who has not only no property and not only no family, but no society and no state. And thus, if you turn to page 257, the decline of the European nation-state system, which, by the way, is the title or part of the title of chapter 9, the key chapter of her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is about how the rights of man, human rights, emerge at the same time as the decline of the European nation-state system, and thus the appearance of refugees. Those are the main parts of that chapter in The Origins of Totalitarianism. What the decline of the nation-state and the rise of refugees mean is that individual men either become part of transnational movements like pan-Germanism, Aryan nationism, or pan-Slavism, the International of Communism, or they become excluded refugees. And man becomes reduced to this sort of naked humanity with no place or protection in the world. And another element of that is imperialism or globalization. Insofar as imperialism and globalization are economic principles and economic movements of infinite growth that never have an end, politics for Arendt is always about setting limits and setting boundaries and creating meaningful worlds. And so that's another reason why imperialism and globalism are for her just like the decline of the nation state, to which they're related, imperialism and globalism are about the decline of the nation state, are for her progenitors of totalitarianism. So I think you're absolutely right. The refugee is deeply connected to this idea of world alienation, and it fits quite well with Arendt's thought. So, is that helpful? Yeah, good. Let me move on to chapter 36. We can always take more questions on either of them, but chapter 36 is, again, this is my reading of the book, the most important chapter in this entire book. I've given many talks and speeches on it. You can find them. It is the beginning of, so it's called the discovery of the Archimedean point, but it's the beginning of now 5 chapters on the second flight, which is the part of world alienation, which she calls Earth alienation, which is the flight from the Earth to the universe. And this is probably the most difficult part of her book, but it is also, I think, the most challenging and in many ways the most important. If world alienation as a flight from world to self, and thus the refugee, is represented by 2 events, namely mapping of the world and the expropriation of the peasants, Earth alienation has its event that crystallizes it in the discovery of the telescope by Galileo. And she says that this discovery was much less important at the time and much less thought of than either mapping or expropriation, but it has turned out to be more important. And just to focus us on that, because I do want to make this case, if you turn to page 264, she is going to say in the bottom of the middle paragraph, she's going to say, compared with the Earth alienation underlying the development of natural sciences in the modern age, world alienation is of minor significance, right? And so this is, I mean, there's more to it than that, but this is just to show you that I'm not making it up, that this chapter 36 and what it's now about to show us is really the center of what she's after. So how do we understand Earth alienation based on the discovery of the telescope? Well, turn to page 259 at the very bottom. And she writes, what Galileo did and what nobody had done before was to use the telescope in such a way that the secrets of the universe were delivered to human cognition, quote, she's quoting Galileo here, with the certainty of sense perception. That is, he put within the grasp of an earthbound creature and its body-bound senses what had seemed forever out of reach. So this is sort of the common sense tale of the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution increased our knowledge by giving us certain knowledge of those things which we used to not have certain knowledge of because we couldn't see them, right? So we couldn't see the moons of Jupiter or the moons of Saturn. We couldn't see mountains on the moon. But the telescope allowed us to see not mountains on the moon, but shadows from which Galileo was able to deduce, oh, well, the shadows must be caused by mountains. And so we were able to, with the certainty of sense perception, come to know the secrets of the universe. We don't usually see cells in the human body, but we could now understand that the body is comprised of cells and cellular structures. And for Arendt, this is usually told as a triumphal story. We can know it all, and thus we can master the world. But what she says is you can't ignore the fact that this story has also been a story of despair. And it's not an accident that Cartesian philosophy, which begins with doubt, starts about 3 decades after Galileo's discovery of the telescope. And so on page 261, she writes, in the middle of the page, the same phenomena, namely the telescope and its certainty that it offers, is not only triumphal, but is blamed with equal right for the hardly less demonstrable increase in human despair, or the specifically modern nihilism, which has spread to ever larger sections of the population. And she continues a couple of lines down. The modern astrophysical worldview, which began with Galileo and its challenge to the adequacy of the senses to reveal reality, have left us a universe of whose qualities we know no more than the way they affect our measuring instruments. So she's turned it around. Galileo says the telescope lets us know the secrets of the universe with the certainty of sense perception. But what do we all know about sense perception? It's often wrong. We see the sun moving and we think it revolves around the earth, but it's wrong. We see a stick in water bent, but it's wrong. And what we start to realize, she says, with the increase of science, is that the entire way we see the world and sense the world is doubtful. And that goes for the way we see the world with our eyes, but also the way we see the world with science. And so we come to realize that we never encounter a real, true, or objective world. All we encounter is ourselves. And here she cites the German physicist Werner Heisenberg, who says that in the natural sciences, man seeks for objective truth, but always depends and finds simply himself. And the result is what she says, that in the turn to science, what we actually do is foster doubt. And we foster our sense of alienation from not only the world that we live in, but the earth that we live on, because we increasingly have to look at everything, not just the moon and not just our the cells in our body, and not just tables and not just mountains, but the earth itself from a perspective of universal science. We think in terms of the universe. We think that the earth itself was created and might fall and might disappear. And we start to see the world not according to objective, true criteria, but at its height through the highest human science, which she calls algebra. Now, why algebra and not mathematics? Because mathematics traditionally was geometry, and geometry is spatial. The reason the highest modern science is algebraic and not geometric is because geometry alienates us even from the spatiality of geometry. It frees us from the shackles of all spatial and earth experience, and we try and understand the world fully mathematically and abstractly. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of this to hopefully, I hope, make sense of it. I wrote my first book, The Gift of Science, about legal science and the move from a geometric idea of science to an algebraic idea of science. And the principle of science that underlies this move was developed by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German mathematician and jurist. And the principle says, nihil est sine ratione, nothing is without a reason. And if we understand what that means, Leibniz says, we means that nothing is unless and until there are reasons for it, which means nothing exists until and if we can rationally show it to be true. What that means is that reality depends upon rationality, depends upon science. And this is what Arendt, and in his legal writing, what Leibniz says is common sense ideas of justice have to be checked against rational scientific ideas of justice, which can be derived with mathematical precision. And so we replace justice as a human idea of relations that grows up locally through customs and instincts of people living together with a rational idea of justice, which is supposed to fit together with scientific systems that can be tested and understood by people who are not part of a particular human community. Arendt says a similar thing at the bottom of page 266, where she says, about 5 lines from the bottom, now the phenomena, okay, namely real objective things in the world, could be saved only insofar as they could be reduced to a mathematical order, and this mathematical operation does not serve to prepare man's mind for the revelation of true being by directing it to the ideal measures that appear in sensually given data, but serves, on the contrary, to reduce these data to the measure of the human mind, which, given enough distance between sufficiently remote and uninvolved, can look upon and handle the multitude and variety of the concrete in accordance with its own patterns and symbols. The premise here is we now check. It used to be that what science did is took reality and tried to understand it through science. That's what natural science tries to do. What she's now saying is universal science actually says reality only exists if it's rationally and scientifically provable, which means that the phenomena that we see and understand are only true if they're rationally provable and understandable. And this leads us into the next chapter, which is the difference between universal versus rational science. Just to summarize, the telescope, right? The telescope allows us to see the moon. And things on the moon we could not see with our eyes. It teaches us that senses are less reliable than the mathematically aided use of instruments, right? We use mathematics to understand what we see. And so it teaches us to distrust our senses. And in doing so, what she says is that this was not the intent of the natural scientists, but it has led over time to us to the point in which we actually think that universal science is more real than the real things that we encounter with our senses in the world. Now, that's going to be what she's going to argue in chapters 37, and I'm going to go through that in a little bit. But let me see if there's any questions about chapter 36 before I do that. I realize this is complicated. This is the most complicated chapter probably in the book, but it's key. And I'd like to see if anyone has some questions that will allow me to see where you're getting and not getting.
Roger, this is John Bevan calling. Can you hear me?
Yes, John, I'm sorry. I muted my mic so I don't get feedback.
Okay. As somebody who spent his whole life in science, I found these 3 chapters obviously humbling, disturbing to many, to some degree, but also exhilarating. But there was one aspect of science that that I wondered whether what Arendt might have thought of them, and that was Karl Popper's notion that the essence of science as we practice it is falsifiability. It must be it must be able to be falsified in principle for it to be true science. And I've often felt that ordinary people, most people don't understand this about science. They think science is absolute in some way, but I think true scientists sort of know that falsifiability is always there. Any comment?
Yeah, no, John, that's a good comment, and so I think there's different levels in which to respond to it on. One is that Arendt is talking on two levels. First, the scientific level, and then sort of the level of scientific culture and how people respond to it. But so yes, the scientists know that when we look at the moon and we make these calculations, or we look at some stars orbiting Saturn or Jupiter, the moons of Saturn, right? Moons of Jupiter, and we determine that they follow an elliptical pattern, as Galileo did, that these are hypotheses and falsifiable. Arendt, but Arendt has no problem with that. I think that's true. Her claim is that what science promises, every scientist knows that and has to remain humble. But what drives science forward is the desire to know with certainty. I mean, that's the quote she offers from Galileo, right? That we want to know with the certainty of sense perception. Clearly, it's a hypothesis, what we know, and yet what drives the scientist in her telling and in Galileo's telling is a desire for certainty, a desire to make the mysteries certain. In doing so, the scientist, by necessity, right, has to abstract him or herself from the worldly, earthly viewpoint. Because even if you're just trying to create a hypothesis, you have to look at the world from outside. You have to abstract yourself from here and look at it from a true viewpoint. I mean, one example that I think she uses to great effect in another essay of hers is that if you look at human beings in their cars from space, you don't see human beings. You see people in little shells moving, around. And she says, from a scientific point of view, human beings are simply data points on a planet called the Earth. And we no longer, science looks at us as, we can understand how human beings move and what they do, and that they need to eat and they need to go places. And we actually there's no need that we actually think of them as meaningful human entities. They're just the way we look at ants from Earth. And now this is the way many sociologists and geographers are looking at human beings, trying to trace humans through their external behavior. And what she's saying is that in order to pursue the effort of understanding things that happen on Earth, including human beings, we have to reduce terrestrial sense data to mathematical symbols. And in doing so, we may lead only to hypotheses. We may lead to things that have to be falsified. But what we do is we create an understanding of the world that is inhuman. Right? I mean, yeah, we know that when somebody does a data plot of human migration patterns, that it could be falsified and that it can be added. But we begin to think about the fact that, oh, humans are just moving things like ants are moving things, and that we can start to recreate and think about how to make roads or borders or nations based not on our daily lived experience, but on systematic computer models based on data that is analyzed from an extraterrestrial universal point of view. That's her claim. Does that help at all or not?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes.
You want to respond, or I don't want to. I don't know if I'm getting to your question or not.
Well, I agree with what you said, but I was specifically interested in what she would have thought about the falsifiability per se. But that's all right. Let's go on to the next chapter.
Okay. I mean, just so you know, I don't think she would have a problem with the falsifiability hypothesis. I just don't think she thinks it touches this. I don't think it prevents or impacts this analysis. Any other questions about chapter 36?
Roger, would you give a summary statement, a sentence, of what is meant by the Archimedean point that was discovered to carry that, so I can carry that forward with me, please?
Yes, the Archimedean point. So Archimedes was a Greek thinker and businessman and scientist who once said that if I could have who was talking about principles of levers and leverage, and said, if I had a lever long enough and a fulcrum far enough away, I could lever the earth and move the earth. And Arendt uses this epigraph from Franz Kafka at page 248. He found the Archimedean point, right? He, man, found the Archimedean point, but he used it against himself. It seems that he was permitted to find it only under this condition. The point is that what science does is find for us the point. What is the point? The point at which we can lever the earth, metaphorically speaking, the point at which we can think ourselves off the earth to such an extent that we can look at the earth as not our home, but simply some mechanical, some body, something. We can alienate ourselves from the earth alienation, such that we can look at the earth as according to, well, God created the earth once, right? Or something created the earth. And since there must be a reason that, and therefore it's explainable not only why, but how God created the earth, we could do it again. That means that we can separate ourselves from the earth and make ourselves not people who are fated to and live upon earth, but people who could create a new earth. And so the Archimedean point is that we now can think ourselves and think about the earth and ourselves. We can create humans from a point so far distant that we and the earth become simply created data points, created things to be understood. And thus, the second part of Kafka's sentence, he was permitted to find the Archimedean point only under the condition that he uses it against himself. Namely, we devalue ourselves. In conquering science and thus the earth, we devalue the earth and all that's on it, including humanity. Is that all right?
Yep, very good. Thanks very much.
Okay. The last chapter that we read for today was chapter 37, Universal versus Natural Science. And here's where Arendt, in a sense, further draws out these distinctions that she's been making. So let's just pay attention to a couple of lines. About right on the top of the chapter 37, she says, 3 lines down, only we, and we only for hardly more than a few decades, have come to live in a world thoroughly determined by a science and a technology whose objective truth and practical know-how are derived from cosmic and universal as distinguished from terrestrial and natural laws, right? There is, she says, continuing on, a deep gulf between those before us who knew that the earth revolves around the sun. Now, these are natural scientists, right? We no longer believe that the sun revolves around the earth like pre-scientific people. Natural scientists know that the earth revolves around the sun. But they're different from ourselves, who still and probably forever are earthbound creatures. We still live on the earth, and we're dependent upon terrestrial nature. But we have found the means to bring about processes of cosmic origin and possibly cosmic dimension. What she means is natural scientists knew how to master nature, but we know how to radically transform and even destroy nature. Now, what does it mean to destroy nature? It doesn't simply mean like to drop a nuclear bomb on it, because then there would still be nature. But what it does mean is, she gives an example of this again in that essay, Conquest of Nature, Conquest of Space. Imagine that we created a spaceship and we sent ourselves up into space, and the entire world that the people in the spaceship lived in was mechanical, human made. And not only that, we started to use cloning and test tube babies to develop a kind of humanly evolved species that would live in this spaceship. Her argument in there is that we would begin to live in a world in which there was no nature. Now, of course, there are metal and there's flesh and there's things that are natural, but nature for her means also faded beyond human control, without the that's not fully humanly artificially artificed. And what she's saying is the natural science world is where we try and master and even change and manipulate nature for our uses. But the new world, the world of our world, is a world in which we may actually eradicate nature. We may actually so artificially construct our environment and our world in which we live that we almost never encounter anything natural. Not in the sense of biologically natural, although that may be true too, but in the sense of natural, in the sense of outside of humanly designed processes. We could actually start to, through nanotechnology, right, insert humanly programmed cells into the body and humanly programmed organs into the body. By the way, we're doing this, right? We can insert nanotechnology into oceans and into rivers and into dirt to influence the way that oceans flow, the way that tides happen, the way that fish feed. And we can start, of course, creating bio crops, artificially created crops that provide more nutrition, cheaper, without, and the point is not that dirt will disappear, although it's very potentially possible that we somehow make all dirt mechanical or in some sense, but that dirt will become a humanly created substance, and cells will become a humanly created substance. And that is That is what she's saying here, is that it used to be that science was used by men to change, manipulate, understand, and improve our world. But increasingly, we're hitting a point in which science, universal science, is not about changing and manipulating our world, but in a sense, remaking our world as artificial on principles of both physics, but also political science and social science and anthropological science and economic science that are designed to make the world in a humanly created way, not in a godly created way. And this is what she's talking about on the paragraph that begins from 268 to 269. Foremost in our minds at this moment is, of course, the enormously increased power of destruction, right? However, no less awesome and no less difficult to come to terms with is the corresponding new creative power that we can produce new elements never found in nature. We can create new elements, right? That we can transform mass into energy, that we can make new stars, new planets. And of course, the top of the iceberg is to create or recreate the miracle of life. And she says, I use the word create deliberately to indicate that we are actually doing what all ages before us thought to be the exclusive prerogative of divine action. And she says, this isn't blasphemous anymore, although it strikes us as blasphemous because we're already doing it. The point is that our premise of universal science is that since creation is something comprehensible, it can be imitated. And if God could do it, we could do it. All right. I'm going to stop there and leave time for one or two questions if people are interested in asking a question about this.
Roger, Harold here. So it occurred to me in reading this and then you're mentioning this spaceship, that this is what the Mars movement is all about. It's preparation for the destruction of the Earth, total Earth alienation, and the belief that a human being has no connection to the Earth other than some chemical physical connection, so that if we can create oxygen and carbon and nitrogen someplace else, that human beings can exist there. And to a certain degree, it seems that some people are acquiescing to this idea that it's okay to destroy the Earth because, we'll go to Mars and live in the equivalent of her spaceship.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I would say, so first of all, Elon Musk and many people in Silicon Valley take this very seriously. Elon Musk is the person financing the Mars exploration movement, SpaceX, or one of them, and they would state, and I'm trying to be. I have a lot of. I read these people a lot because I think they're expressing the truths that Hannah Arendt is talking about. Ray Kurzweil also with the idea of the singularity, the idea that we will very soon not only merge humans with machines, but in doing so, we will so increase human intelligence that we will merge humans with the intelligence of the cosmos. That's his argument in his books, The Singularity is Near and other ones. And that we will become all powerful, all knowing, in a sense, at one with the intelligence of the universe. The Mars movement, of course, is still not far enough for these folks, because if you live on Mars, even if you create a bubble and you live in the bubble, you still have to go outside the bubble. The real movement that I think you're pointing to, Harold, is, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's called terraforming. And this is a movement, and if you go on the internet, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of websites and people working on it, which is the idea that we shouldn't go and settle in a bubble on Mars, but we should build new planets and create perfectly engineered new planets that we could then create the atmosphere and the conditions on them in which we want to live, and go and live on them. And that is in many ways the where this is going. And I think you're right to see it that way. I'll take one more question if someone has one. Otherwise, well, we can end.
I'd just like to make one more comment.
Yeah.
An old friend of mine, who's a scientist, has frequently said to me, "We will not, destroy the earth. The earth will destroy us." That's all.
Okay. I think that's probably fair, and I think that's what Elon Musk is responding to, right? Which is we need a new place. I think Arendt, if I'm understanding Arendt correctly, the response would be, the earth may not destroy us, and we may not destroy the earth, but that's because we will be able to transform the earth and make it serve our purposes and change it into in a sense, technological, smart, living, breathing planet. One of the ways we're trying to fight global warming is by putting new molecules into the oceans and into the atmosphere that will absorb carbon. One of the ways, and so, a lot of technologists say, don't worry about global warming. We will be able to, in a sense, make the earth breathe better. And we'll be able to make the atmosphere work better, and it shouldn't be something we worry about. That's a meaningful argument, because these problems like global warming are so severe, many of us will turn to technological solutions. But those technological solutions are not about just using less energy. They're about changing the planet and its atmosphere. And that attitude, right? On the one, it's sort of, okay, let's look at the border. To what extent is that natural science? We can understand and transform and improve our life on Earth. But to what extent is it universal science in the sense of a kind of Earth alienation? Well, the planet itself doesn't have any inherent beauty or use. That beautiful blue-green planet with blue-green oceans, with mountains. We could and we may find ways to make the planet more efficient, more useful, more habitable, and we actually have no limits. And once the Earth stops providing limits, then we enter the age of universal science as opposed to natural science. That's how she understands it. Because natural doesn't mean, again, dirt or rocks or whatever. It means that there are limits that we as people who are born and limited on this world have. And universal science is about transcending those limits for Arendt. The next chapters are how this scientific transformation from natural to universal science gets translated into philosophy and general cultural views of the world. And so that's what we'll read for next month. And I look forward to seeing you then. Until then, enjoy reading The Human Condition. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.